The moment Rosa Keene slammed her leather satchel down on the counter of the Caldwell land office, every man in that stuffy, sun-bleached room turned to look at her, and not a single one of them moved to help. It was the summer of 1878, and Caldwell, Kansas, sat right on the edge of everything. The edge of the cattle trail, the edge of civilization, the edge of a future that men were building on paper, while women like Rosa Keene were left standing outside the door, knocking until their knuckles bled. The town smelled of horses and sawdust and sun-baked earth, and the land office smelled of ink and pipe tobacco, and the particular kind of arrogance that blooms when a man believes his desk grants him authority over another person's life. Rosa was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up beneath a practical brown hat, and brown eyes that had a way of going very still and very sharp when she was angry. She was angry now. She had been angry for 3 weeks, in fact, ever since the land office had sent back her homestead claim, with a rejection notice stamped in red ink so bright it seemed to mock her from the page. "I am telling you for the 4th time, Mr. Greer," she said, keeping her voice low and controlled, which was somehow more frightening than shouting, "that this claim is entirely valid. My father filed the original survey in 1874 before he died. The land has been in continuous use since then. I have lived on it, worked it, and paid taxes on it for 4 years. You cannot simply reject my title claim because my name is on it instead of a man's." Gerald Greer was the land office clerk, a narrow-shouldered man of about 50, with ink-stained fingers and the expression of someone who had eaten something unpleasant. He wore a vest that was too tight across the middle and spectacles that he kept pushing up his nose as though the gesture lent him authority. "Miss Keene," he said, drawing out her name in a way that managed to be both condescending and dismissive at once, "the Homestead Act requires that a claimant be either the head of a household or a single person over 21 years of age who is a citizen of the United States." "I am 26 years old," Rosa said. "I am unmarried. I am a citizen. I meet every one of those requirements." "The act also requires proof of improvement," Greer said, shuffling papers as though the conversation bored him. "Your claim lacks the proper affidavits." "I brought affidavits." Rosa opened her satchel and pulled out a neat stack of folded papers, 3 of them, from neighbors who have witnessed the improvements on my land: a well, a barn, 40 acres under cultivation, a house with a stone foundation. She laid each paper on the counter with a quiet precision that made every slap of paper on wood sound like an accusation. "What exactly is missing, Mr. Greer?" Greer looked at the papers without touching them. "The Hendricks parcel," he said. "That land was recently resurveyed, and there is a competing claim filed by Mr. Calvin Marsh." Rosa went very still. "Calvin Marsh has no legal right to that parcel. His claim was filed after my father's original survey. In the law, first filing takes precedence." "When the original claimant is deceased," Greer said, with the air of a man producing a trump card, "the claim must be refiled in the surviving heir's name. Your refiling is in dispute because Mr. Marsh contends that your father's original claim was never properly registered." "That is a lie," Rosa said, and her voice cracked on the last word just slightly before she pulled it back under control. "I have the original registration certificate right here." She drew out one more paper, older than the others, its edges soft with age, and placed it on the counter. "Dated July the 12th, 1874. Registered at the Wichita Land Office. The record exists. You can verify it." Greer looked at the certificate. He looked at Rosa. He pushed his spectacles up his nose. "I will have to consult with the regional office," he said, which was the bureaucratic way of saying nothing, meaning nothing, promising nothing, while the seconds of a woman's life ticked away. "You have been consulting with the regional office for 3 weeks," Rosa said. "While you consult, Calvin Marsh is grazing his cattle on my land. His men have torn down one section of my fence. My crops are being destroyed. I need this resolved now, Mr. Greer, not in another 3 weeks." "I understand your frustration, Miss Keene," Greer said, in the tone of a man who understood nothing of the sort. "But there is a process, and I cannot simply override. You are not being asked to override anything. You are being asked to read the document in front of you and do your job." The office had gone very quiet. Two other men sat in chairs along the wall, ranchers waiting for their own business, Rosa assumed, and they were watching with the careful neutrality of men who did not want to get involved. A young clerk at a desk near the window had stopped writing and was staring at the countertop. Then the door opened. He came in with the light behind him, the way men do in that particular hour of the Kansas morning when the sun sits just above the roofline and turns everything gold and slightly blinding. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of lean muscle that comes from years of actual physical work rather than any vanity. He wore a dark coat over a faded blue shirt, dusty trousers, and boots that had seen serious mileage across serious country. His hat was a battered thing, the brim shaped by years of sun and rain into a curve that suited him perfectly. He had a jaw that could have been carved from the same limestone that made up half the Kansas landscape, dark eyes beneath dark brows, and a mouth that, just then, was set in the quiet attention of a man who walked into a room and immediately understood the situation. His name was Hugh Ashford. He was 30 years old, a cattle drover who had ridden the Kisham Trail 4 times and who currently worked a small spread of his own about 8 miles east of Caldwell, raising horses and doing well enough to be his own man, which was all he had ever wanted. He had come to the land office that morning to file a grazing lease renewal, a simple piece of business that should have taken 10 minutes, and he had walked in to find a woman standing at the counter like a soldier defending a position, surrounded by papers, arguing with a man who was clearly not listening to her. Hugh Ashford stood in the doorway for about 4 seconds. He read the papers on the counter from where he stood, the registration certificate with its faded ink, the affidavits in their neat stack, the bright red rejection notice tucked at the edge. He looked at the clerk's expression, which was the expression of a man who had decided the outcome before the argument began. He looked at Rosa Keene, who was holding herself so straight and so still that it cost her something to do it, and he could see it costing her from across the room. He walked to the counter and stood beside her. "She is right," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It had the quality of a statement rather than an argument, the kind of voice that does not invite contradiction because it does not sound like it's inviting anything. It sounds like it is simply telling the truth. Gerald Greer looked at Hugh Ashford with the expression of a man reassessing his position. "I beg your pardon. The Homestead Act," Hugh said. Section 2. A single woman over 21 qualifies as a claimant. She has the original registration certificate in front of you. First filing takes precedence over a competing claim when the original is properly registered, which it is. He nodded at the paper on the counter. "That certificate from the Wichita office is the proof you need. It is right there." Rosa turned her head to look at this man beside her. She had not asked for help. She had not looked at him when he came in, because she had been focused entirely on Greer, and also because she had learned that looking around for help when you were a woman trying to hold your ground in a room full of men was a good way to lose it. But she looked at him now. He did not look back at her immediately. He was still looking at Greer with that steady, unhurried attention. "Are you a lawyer?" Greer said. "No," Hugh said, "but I can read, and I have filed 3 homestead claims in my life and know the law well enough. Her claim is valid. The competing claim from Marsh is a secondary filing and cannot override a properly registered original. The only question is whether you process her paperwork today or whether this goes to the regional superintendent, who I expect will agree with her and wonder why it took so long." Greer's mouth opened and then closed. He looked at the certificate again. He looked at the affidavits. Something in his expression shifted, not into warmth, because men like Greer did not warm easily, but into the particular calculation of someone weighing how much trouble he was willing to invite. "I will process the claim," Greer said, and even those 4 words carried a small resentment, as if processing the valid paperwork of a person with a legal right to it was a gift he was bestowing rather than a job he was required to do. "Good," Hugh said. Rosa let out a breath. It was a small, controlled breath, barely audible, but it was the kind that carries the weight of 3 weeks of tension and fear and sleepless nights. She gathered her papers, leaving the registration certificate and affidavits on the counter, and placed them back in her satchel with the same precise movement she had used throughout the confrontation. "Thank you, Mr. Greer," she said, because she was going to be courteous if it killed her, which sometimes it felt like it might. Greer was already pulling a ledger from beneath the counter and not meeting her eyes. Rosa turned to walk to the bench along the wall to wait, and she found herself standing directly in front of Hugh Ashford, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes that came from squinting into the sun across long distances, and the particular quality of his attention, which was direct without being aggressive, like a man who was simply interested in what he was looking at. "Thank you," she said quietly. Not the kind of thank you she had given Greer, which had been armor. This one was something else. "He was wrong," Hugh said simply. Then, after a pause, "Hugh Ashford." "Rosa Keene," she said. She shifted her satchel on her shoulder. "You have filed 3 homestead claims. 2 were mine. 1 was for a friend who did not read well. The corner of his mouth moved just barely. I read the act thoroughly each time. It seemed useful." "It was," she said. He stepped to the counter to conduct his own business, and Rosa sat on the bench and watched the clerk process her paperwork with the grim efficiency of a man who knows he has been outmaneuvered. She noticed that Hugh Ashford handled his own transaction without dramatics, simply presenting his documents, signing where required, and exchanging a few words with the junior clerk in a tone that was friendly without being ingratiating. He collected his copy and turned to leave, and then stopped at the door and looked at her. "Your land," he said. "The parcel with the competing claim, is it east of the Creek Road?" Rosa straightened. "About a mile east and 3 miles south. The Keene parcel, 160 acres. He nodded slowly. "I know that land. It is good land." A pause. "Marsh is a hard man to deal with if he decides he wants something." "I am aware," Rosa said. "Do you have someone looking after the place while you are in town?" The question landed in a complicated way, because it was a practical question and a kind question, and also a question that quietly acknowledged something Rosa had been trying not to think about too directly, that Calvin Marsh did not stop at fences, and she was 6 miles away from her land right now. "My neighbor, Mr. Dooley, said he would ride past this morning," she said. "He is 70 years old and well-meaning." Hugh Ashford looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes that took things in carefully and did not perform at anything. "I am heading east," he said. "My spread is past the Creek Road. I can ride out with you if you would like company." Rosa considered him. She was not a woman who accepted offers easily, because most offers in her experience came attached to assumptions she was not willing to accept. But this man had walked into a room, read a situation, spoken 5 words that turned the tide of 3 weeks of frustration, and then introduced himself as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. He had not told her what to do. He had not explained anything to her about the law that she did not already know. He had simply confirmed out loud in front of the person who needed to hear it that she was correct. "All right," she said. "I will be another 15 minutes here." "I will be outside," he said, and walked out into the gold morning light. Rosa sat with her papers and her satchel and her carefully maintained composure, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she felt the faint, dangerous warmth of something that was not quite hope but was in the same family as it. The morning had burned off into a hot, blue-skied Kansas afternoon by the time they rode east along the Creek Road. The road was hard-packed earth bordered on either side by tall grass that whispered and moved in the wind like water, and the cottonwoods along the creek threw shade in long strips across the path. Rosa rode her own horse, a steady bay mare named Pearl, and Hugh Ashford rode a gray gelding that moved with the particular loose-limbed ease of a horse that had covered a great deal of ground in its life. They rode side by side with a comfortable distance between them, not too close, not so far apart that conversation would require raising voices. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. Rosa had learned in her years of running the Keene place alone to be at ease with silence, and she found that this man seemed to understand the same. "How long have you run the place on your own?" Hugh asked, after they had been riding for perhaps 20 minutes. "For years," Rosa said. "My father died in the spring of 1874. He had just finished the survey. He was very proud of that land." She paused, watching the road ahead. "He came from Virginia originally. He said that land was the only honest thing because it did not lie about what it was." "Your father sounds like a man who thought carefully about things." "He was," Rosa said. "He taught me to read surveys and deed descriptions before he taught me to cook." A flicker of something in her expression, not quite a smile, but the memory of one. "My mother thought this was the wrong order of priorities." "Is your mother?" "She passed when I was 12, Rosa said. "Fever." "I am sorry." "Thank you." She adjusted her hat against the angle of the sun. "What about you? The 8 miles east of Caldwell." He glanced at her with what might have been the beginning of surprise that she had already noted the distance. "How did you know that?" "You said you were heading east and that your spread was past the creek road. When I mentioned my land, you said you knew it, which means you have been past it." "There are only 2 ranches east of the creek road before the river. The Anson place, which burned 2 years ago, and the Ashford spread, which I have heard mentioned in town." Hugh Ashford looked at the road ahead, and this time the corner of his mouth moved far enough to qualify as an actual expression. "Horses mostly," he said. "Some cattle. I have been building it for 6 years. It was nothing when I came to it, bare land and a broken-down shed." "You built it yourself?" "With help. I had a hand named Marcus for 2 years and a neighbor named Pete Dalloway who helped with the barn raising. But mostly, yes." "And now?" "Now I have a house with 4 solid walls and a good roof, 120 acres, a herd of 30 horses, and a dog who believes he is in charge of everything." He paused. "His name is Captain. He takes the name seriously." Rosa laughed. It came out before she thought about it, and it surprised her, not the laugh itself, but that it was genuine, full, and entirely unguarded. She had not laughed like that in a while. She looked sideways at Hugh Ashford and found him looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, something quietly attentive, like a man who has just seen something he wants to remember. "I have a dog too," she said. "His name is Biscuit, and he is completely useless as a working dog but very sincere about keeping me company while I work." "That is a different kind of value," Hugh said. They rode on, and the conversation moved through things the way good conversation does, finding its way from one topic to the next without effort, each subject opening naturally into another. Hugh told her about the Kishom Trail, about the particular madness of driving cattle 800 miles with 8 men, and a cook who quarreled with everyone. Rosa told him about the summer she had put in the well herself, hiring 2 men from town to dig, while she operated the pulley system and read the surveying guides her father had left her. He told her about a winter when the snow had come so fast and so deep that he had spent 3 days in the barn with his horses before he could dig out. She told him about the autumn a flash flood had taken out the south fence, and she had rebuilt it in 4 days with her own hands, because the cattle she was running at the time could not wait for a fence crew. They were at her gate before she expected to be, the 3-mile ride having passed in what felt like a quarter of the time it usually took. The Keene parcel opened up before them. The house, which was small but solid, built of limestone blocks her father had quarried from the creek bed, with a good shingle roof she had relaid 2 winters ago. Beyond the house, the barn with its weathered red paint, still good, still standing. The well with its neat wooden cover. The 40 acres of corn and wheat running in straight rows to the south, green and reaching. It was not grand, but it was hers, and every inch of it had been tended with the kind of care that comes from knowing something is both precious and fragile. The south fence was intact. Mr. Dooley had apparently been by, and there was a note tucked into the gate post. Rosa pulled it free and read it, and her shoulders dropped half an inch in relief. "Dooley says Marsh's men were not here this morning," she said. "Good." Hugh sat his horse and looked at the place with the appraising eye of someone who understands land and labor. "You have done excellent work here," he said, and it was not a compliment delivered to make her feel good. It was a statement of fact from a man who knew what excellent work looked like. "Thank you," Rosa said. She opened the gate and led Pearl through, then turned back. "Would you like some water before you ride on? It is another 3 miles to your place." "I would not want to impose." "It is water, Mr. Ashford, not a 4-course dinner. Come in." He dismounted and led his gray through the gate. She gave him water, and she gave him coffee, which she made strong and good on the iron stove. Her father had hauled from Wichita in a wagon before she was born. They sat at the kitchen table, a solid oak table her father had built, and drank coffee and talked, and Biscuit, the useless but sincere dog, came and put his shaggy head on Hugh's knee and regarded him with solemn brown eyes, and Hugh scratched his ears without looking down, which Rosa noticed, because a man who is comfortable with animals is a man who has spent time being honest. The afternoon light came through the south-facing window and fell across the table in rectangles of gold, and Rosa found herself watching Hugh Ashford's hands where they rested around his coffee cup, large, capable hands, scarred in a few places, steady and thinking about how he had come into the land office and said 5 words and changed everything. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "Why did you step in this morning? You did not know me. You had your own business to conduct. You could have simply waited." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. He was wrong, he said, which was what he had said in the office, and she understood now that it was not an incomplete answer, it was the complete answer. For Hugh Ashford it was as simple as that. He had seen a wrong thing being done and he had said so. That was the beginning and end of his calculation. "Not everyone sees it that way," Rosa said. "No," he agreed. "I know." He looked up at her. "My mother filed a homestead claim in Nebraska in 1862. She was widowed. She had 3 children. The clerk told her that without a male cosigner her claim could not be processed." He paused. "She found a different clerk. But she never forgot the first one, and she made sure I never forgot him either." Rosa set down her coffee cup. "Is she still in Nebraska?" "She died in 1871, but the land is still there. My brother runs it." He looked at the window at the golden Kansas afternoon outside. "She proved her claim. She proved it, and she held it, and she raised 3 children on it, and no one ever gave her a single thing she did not earn herself." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Rosa said. "She was," Hugh said, "the most stubborn person I have ever known, which I mean as the highest possible compliment." Rosa smiled. "I have been called stubborn as well." "By people who were inconvenienced by your being correct," Hugh said. That startled another genuine laugh out of her, and she watched his face ease into something warmer than he had been showing all morning. And she thought that this man, this Hugh Ashford who had ridden 8 miles east of Caldwell and built his horses and his house and his life with his own hands, was perhaps the most unexpectedly comfortable person she had ever sat across a table from. He left when the afternoon began to tip toward evening, because it was a 3-mile ride and he had evening chores, and Rosa stood at her gate and watched him go, the gray gelding moving at an easy trot along the creek road, the man in his battered hat sitting his horse with the relaxed ease of someone who has spent more of his life on horseback than off it. And she thought about the fact that she did not know when she would see him again, and that thought had more weight to it than she expected. She went back inside and started the evening, fed Biscuit, checked the south fence herself, walked the perimeter of the corn rows in the long light, and tried very hard not to spend too much time thinking about dark eyes and a voice that said, "She is right," as though it were the simplest possible observation. She did not entirely succeed. 3 days later, Hugh Ashford rode back down the creek road and knocked on her gate post, and when she came out from the barn where she had been repairing a harness, he said, "I found something you should see," and showed her a notice that had been posted at the general store in Caldwell, a legal notice from Calvin Marsh claiming that the Keene parcel was in dispute and that a hearing had been scheduled before the county judge for the following Tuesday. Rosa read the notice twice. "He filed for a hearing even after the land office processed my claim. Marsh has money and he has lawyers," Hugh said. "He is going to try to fight it in court. Can he do that? He can try. Whether he wins is a different question." Hugh dismounted and tied his gray to the fence post. "Do you have representation?" Rosa's jaw tightened. "I had a lawyer in Wichita who helped me understand my father's original filing. I do not know if he handles county court proceedings. There is a man in Caldwell named Petrie. He does land cases. He is honest, which is not a thing I say about many lawyers, and he knows the statutes well." He paused. "I can take you to him if you would like. Today, if you are able." She looked at him. "You rode 8 miles to bring me this notice." "I rode 8 miles because I was coming this way anyway," he said, and the slight straightening of his expression told her that this was perhaps not entirely accurate, but that he had decided it was a reasonable thing to say. Rosa almost argued with it, then decided not to. "Let me get my satchel," she said, and went inside. Petrie the lawyer was a round-faced man of about 45 with a good mind, an untidy office, and the particular combination of competence and directness that Rosa found immediately reassuring. He reviewed her documents for an hour while she sat across his desk, and Hugh sat in the chair beside her, and did not say anything unnecessary, which she appreciated. At the end of the hour, Petrie looked up and said, "Miss Keene, your claim is sound. The original 1874 registration is the foundation, and it is solid. Marsh's people are going to argue survey irregularities and claim abandonment, but both of those arguments fail against the evidence you have." He tapped the file. "The affidavits from your neighbors are good. The tax records are excellent. I can win this." "What are your fees?" Rosa asked. Petrie named a number that was fair and that Rosa could manage if she was careful. She said yes. Outside on the boardwalk in the late afternoon heat of a Kansas August, Rosa stood in the street and felt the tension in her chest loosen another degree, and then she looked at Hugh Ashford and said, "You keep appearing at useful moments." "I keep finding myself nearby," he said. She studied him for a moment. The sun was lower now, and it caught the angles of his face in a way that made her very much want to paint him, which was a thought she had not had about another person in years, because she had trained herself rigorously out of the habit of wanting things that complicated her life. "Mr. Ashford," she said. "Hugh, would you have dinner with me? There is a dining room at the hotel that is adequate, and I would like to thank you properly." He looked at her, and there was something in his face that moved not dramatically, but the way light moves when a door opens in a dim room. "I would be glad to," he said. It was, by any objective measure, a dinner and nothing more. 2 people at a table in the modest dining room of the Caldwell Hotel, eating a meal of beef and potatoes that was better than adequate and talking for 2 hours. But Rosa would remember it later as the evening everything shifted, because it was the first time she watched Hugh Ashford talk about something he loved. He talked about horses, not in the abstract, the way men talk about livestock as a category, but specifically about the particular horse he was training right now, a young bay stallion named Arrow who had a brilliant mind and a stubborn streak, and the patience required to work with a horse like that, and the moment when the understanding passes between a horse and the person working with it, that moment when they choose each other. He talked about it with a quiet animation that transformed his usually steady face into something warmer and more open, and Rosa sat across from him and rested her chin on her hand and thought, without planning to think it, that she was in serious trouble. She also talked, more than she usually did, about her father and the land and what it meant to her, not just the property but the idea of it, the principle, that a woman could stand on ground and say this is mine and have the law uphold her, that her father had believed this enough to make it happen and that she was going to make sure it remained so. "He would be proud of you," Hugh said when she had finished. "He would tell me my fence posts need resetting," she said. "Which they do, but yes. I think he would be proud." Hugh smiled then, a full, real smile that she had not seen from him yet, wide enough to show a little of the warmth he kept otherwise well contained, and Rosa felt it like a change in weather, like when the air shifts before a good rain and everything smells different, and you know something is coming. They walked out into the night street afterward, the town still awake around them, a piano going in the saloon down the block, horses at the hitching post, a pair of cowboys crossing the dusty road with their spurs jangling, and they stood by their horses and Rosa said, "Thank you for all of it. For this morning in the land office and for finding the notice and for the lawyer and for tonight. You would have managed all of it without me," Hugh said. "Eventually," Rosa said, "but eventually is expensive when Calvin Marsh is grazing his cattle on your corn." He looked at her in the lamplight from the hotel window, and she held his gaze, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "May I call on you, properly, not just when there is a legal crisis?" The thing Rosa noticed about the way he asked it was that he looked slightly uncertain, which she had not seen from him before, and which affected her in a way she had not anticipated. This steady, careful man who had spoken truth in a land office with perfect confidence, looking at her in the lamplight uncertain. "Yes," she said, "you may." He rode home 8 miles in the dark, and she rode 6 miles in the dark, and they both arrived at their separate places, and separately in the same night. Neither of them slept quite as well as they usually did, which was its own kind of information. The hearing before Judge Roland Harker was set for a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of August, and the courtroom, which was really the back room of the county courthouse, a low-ceilinged space with wooden benches and windows that let in too much heat, was fuller than Rosa had expected. Calvin Marsh had money and he had used it. He was represented by 2 lawyers from Wichita named Tilden and Croft, who wore city suits and carried briefcases, and looked at Rosa's side of the room with the bland confidence of men who expected to win. Petrie, Rosa's lawyer, wore a coat that did not quite fit and brought a briefcase that was held shut with a piece of cord, and looked like exactly the kind of man who did not care about his coat because he was too busy being right. Hugh Ashford was in the 3rd row. He had not announced that he would be there. He was simply there when Rosa arrived, sitting with his hat in his hands and his back straight, and when she saw him, something in her chest performed an action that she chose not to examine too closely. She sat at the plaintiff's table with Petrie and spread her documents in front of her and looked straight ahead at the judge's desk. Calvin Marsh was a large man, well-fed, somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and had curdled slowly over the years into something harder. He sat at his lawyer's table and looked at Rosa with the air of a man who does not believe in the reality of what he is looking at. Judge Harker came in at 9 o'clock and the proceedings began. Tilden opened for Marsh with a presentation that was polished and confident, arguing that the original 1874 Keene survey was improperly registered due to a technical error in the county filing, a discrepancy between the description in the survey document and the description in the county ledger, which differed by a boundary notation that Tilden said rendered the original claim void. Rosa watched Petrie's face as Tilden presented this and saw him write something in his notebook without changing expression, which was either very good or very bad. It turned out to be very good. When Petrie rose, he opened his briefcase and produced a document that the courtroom had not expected. A corrected boundary notation from the Wichita Land Office, dated 1875, 1 year after the original filing, which addressed precisely the discrepancy Tilden had cited and confirmed the Keene claim as valid with the correct notation. The correction had been made during routine review and filed at the state level, and Petrie had spent 3 evenings writing letters to find it. Tilden objected, Croft objected. Petrie presented the state seal on the document and quoted 3 federal land statutes and 1 Kansas territorial decision. And Judge Harker listened to all of it with the expression of a man who had heard everything before and was not especially impressed with any of it. And then he asked Rosa to take the stand. She stood up there in front of the room, in front of Marsh's hired lawyers and the people on the benches and Hugh in the 3rd row, and she told the truth. She described the land as her father had described it to her. The creek bend that marked the south boundary, the limestone formation at the northeast corner, the spring that ran cold even in August from somewhere deep underground. She described the years of work, the well, the barn, the cultivated acres, the stone foundation, the fences. She described the afternoon she had found Marsh's cattle on her South 40 and had ridden over to Marsh's foreman and said politely that the fence had been broken and the cattle needed to be moved. And the foreman had looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been told by his employer that this woman's objections are not relevant. She described it all clearly, without dramatics, without excess emotion, and with the specific, verifiable detail of someone who had lived every word she was saying. And when she stepped down from the stand, Judge Harker looked at both sides for a long moment. The 1874 filing, corrected and confirmed in 1875, constitutes a valid original claim under the Homestead Act, he said. Mr. Marsh's secondary filing, dated 1877, cannot override a prior valid claim. The Keene parcel remains the legal property of Rosa Keene. Miss Keene's title is confirmed. The room exhaled. On the Marsh side, Tilden leaned in and murmured something to Marsh, who had gone very red. On Rosa's side, Petrie closed his briefcase with the contained satisfaction of a man who has done a good job. And from the 3rd row, Rosa heard nothing, but she turned and found Hugh Ashford looking at her with a quieter version of that full smile she had seen across the dinner table, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Calvin Marsh stood up, and for a moment Rosa thought he was going to say something, and from the way Judge Harker's hand moved toward his gavel, he thought so too. But Marsh simply picked up his hat and walked out, his lawyers behind him, and the door swung shut, and the courtroom breathed again. Outside, in the hard white sunlight of the late August morning, Rosa stood on the courthouse steps with her satchel and her confirmed title, and felt a feeling so enormous and complete that, for a moment, she did not know what to do with it. It was victory, yes, but it was more than that. It was the vindication of every night she had sat at her kitchen table going over papers, every hour of work on that land, every argument she had made and remade in her own head against every objection that had been raised. It was her father's July 1874 survey, finally, irrevocably, permanently upheld. Hugh came down the steps behind her and stood beside her in the sun. "Congratulations, Miss Keene," he said. She turned and looked at him, and the thing she had been managing carefully for the past several weeks, the feeling she had been observing from a cautious distance, the way you watch a fire to see how large it is before you decide whether to add wood, was suddenly very present and very real and not especially interested in being managed. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." He met her eyes, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the street went on around them. Horses and wagons and the general noise of a Kansas town on a Tuesday morning, and none of it seemed very important compared to this particular silence. "Petrie won that," Hugh said, "and you, I did not do anything." "You told me about Petrie," Rosa said. "You brought me the notice. You walked into the land office and said 5 words that started everything." She paused. "You were there this morning." "I wanted to be there," he said. She looked at him for another moment, and then she said, "Come to dinner, at my place. This evening, if you can. I am a good cook when I am not too preoccupied with legal proceedings." His face did that thing again, that opening. "I will be there," he said. He was there at 6 o'clock, riding the gray gelding down the creek road in the early evening light, with his hat in one hand because he had taken it off while still mounted, which she recognized as a gesture of deliberate courtesy. She had made a proper dinner, a beef roast that had been going since afternoon, potatoes, fresh bread from the morning, and a pie made from the late-season plums she had dried and kept through the winter. She had set the table with the good plates her mother had brought from Virginia, the ones with the blue painted rim, which she only brought out for occasions. He noticed the plates. He did not say anything about them, but she saw him notice. They ate and talked, and Biscuit lay under the table and occasionally rested his head on Hugh's boot, which Hugh allowed without comment. The evening light went from gold to amber to the soft purple of dusk, and Rosa lit the lamp on the table, and the kitchen felt warm and full of good smells, and she thought that she could not remember the last time her house had felt this inhabited, this attended to by a second presence. After dinner, they sat on the porch in the cooling dark, and the coyotes started up somewhere south, their thin voices carrying across the grass, and the stars came out enormous and closed the way they do on the Kansas plains, where there is nothing to interrupt them. "I have been thinking," Hugh said after a comfortable silence. "About what?" He was quiet for a moment, choosing words with care. "About what is here," he said, "what I have been finding when I ride out this direction." Rosa kept her eyes on the dark horizon. Her heart was doing something very specific and rather inconvenient. "My property is east of here," she said, deliberately misunderstanding him because she needed just one more second to get her footing. He turned and looked at her profile, and she could feel him looking, and she let it go on for about 4 seconds before she turned to look back. "Rosa," he said. "Yes," she said. They looked at each other in the dark on her porch, with the stars above and the coyotes in the distance and the lamp through the window throwing a warm rectangle of light across the porch boards, and he said, "I would like to keep riding this direction, for reasons that have nothing to do with the road." "Those are not very many words for a declaration," she said, which was not what she had intended to say, but was what came out, and she watched something warm move across his face in response. "I am better at actions than declarations," he said, "but I can manage more words if you require them." "What kind of actions?" she said. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. His hand was large and warm and steady, and he held hers the way he seemed to do everything carefully, without excess, with full attention. "That kind," he said simply. Rosa looked at their joined hands in the lamplight. "I am not easy to be around," she said. "I have opinions about things. I argue with land office clerks. I reread survey documentation for entertainment. I am not," she paused, and for a brief moment something softer than her usual precision surfaced, "I am not practiced at this." "Neither am I," he said. "I have spent 6 years building a horse farm 8 miles east of town and talking primarily to my dog and my horses. My social accomplishments are limited." "You seemed accomplished enough at the land office," she said. "That was not social. That was just correct." She laughed, and he held her hand, and the evening went on around them, and nothing was formal or dramatic or declared in precise language. But something was settled between them, the way important things are often settled not with ceremony but with the quiet, irrevocable certainty of a decision that has been made. He rode home that night in the full dark, and she watched the gray gelding disappear down the creek road, and she went inside and blew out the lamp and lay awake in the comfortable, complicated warmth of being someone who has been seen, entirely seen, by another person, and who has found that they do not mind. The autumn came to Kansas the way it always does, suddenly, and then completely. The corn came in well, and Rosa spent 2 weeks harvesting with 2 hired hands from town, and Hugh appeared on 2 of those days and worked without being asked, loading the wagon with the kind of steady, wordless competence that she was beginning to recognize as simply how he moved through any task. He did not announce his help or apologize for its presence. He simply arrived and worked, and when the day was done, they ate whatever Rosa had made, soup or bread and cheese or the occasional roast, and sat on the porch in the cooling evening air and talked. They talked about everything. About the law, which Rosa knew better than most people expected. About horses, which Hugh could talk about for hours, and which Rosa found she could listen to for the same amount of time, not because she was performing interest, but because his enthusiasm for the subject was genuine and catching. About the trail and what he had seen on it, the enormous skies over the Indian Territory, the vastness of the land south of the Arkansas River, the particular loneliness of moving through a landscape that did not acknowledge human presence. About her parents, about his mother in Nebraska and the land she had held, about what they both wanted and what they were both afraid of, which turned out, in the way of long conversations in the dark, to be surprisingly similar things. Hugh was afraid of staying still too long in the wrong direction, of spending years building something that turned out to be built for a life he had not examined closely enough. Rosa was afraid of being alone, not in the immediate daily sense she could manage alone. She had proven that, but in the deeper sense of investing everything in one direction, and having no one who understood what that investment meant. "You understand it," she said, one evening in October, when the first cold was coming off the plains and they had moved inside by the fire. "Your land." He was sitting across from her at the table, and the fire made the room amber and close and warm. "The investment," she said, "the specific weight of what it means to put everything you have into a piece of ground and a life that does not include anyone else who sees it." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I understand that." "I thought you did," she said, "from the first day." He reached across the table and took her hand again, as he had taken to doing, and the gesture was so thoroughly natural now that neither of them had to make a decision about it. "What would you think," he said carefully, "about a life that did include someone else who sees it?" Rosa looked at him across the small table, with the fire behind him and the lamplight between them, and she thought about the 4 years she had managed alone, and the 6 years he had done the same, and the particular completeness of two people who have each proven to themselves that they can stand alone, discovering that standing together is something different, not a replacement but an addition. "I would think," she said, "that the land office would require updated documentation." He looked at her for a moment. "Then is that a yes?" "It is a yes," she said. He was very still for a moment, the way he was still before anything important, as if the stillness were a way of honoring it. Then he stood up from the table and came around it and brought her to her feet and held her hands and looked at her, and he said, "I will do this right. I want to ask you properly." "You just did," she said, and I answered. "Rosa," his voice was quiet, serious, and warm all at once. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said for the second time, and it felt exactly right both times. He kissed her then, which was the first time he had kissed her, and it was the kiss of a man who means everything he does, not rushed, not dramatic, but thorough and genuine and entirely present. And Rosa, who had been managing her feelings about Hugh Ashford with great care since August, let go of all that management at once and was astonished by how good it felt to do so. They were married on the last Saturday of November, 1878, in the small Methodist church in Caldwell, with the preacher and 12 people in attendance. Petrie the lawyer came, and old Mr. Dooley from down the road, and 2 of Hugh's neighbors, and a handful of people from town who had heard about the land office business and approved of it. Rosa wore her mother's blue dress, which she had altered to fit, and Hugh wore a proper dark suit that he had purchased for the occasion, and that fit him well enough, and they stood before the preacher and said the words in voices that were steady and clear and meant. Afterward there was a modest dinner in the church hall, and someone brought a fiddle, and Hugh danced with Rosa in the limited, practical way of a man who did not grow up dancing but was entirely willing to try, and she laughed at his footwork, and he bore this with good humor, and the evening was warm and full, and ended with them driving home together in the wagon, north stars overhead, the black grass moving in the cold wind on either side of the road. They went to his place, their place now. The Ashford spread 8 miles east of Caldwell, because it was the larger of the 2 properties and better suited for 2 people. They kept the Keene parcel, though. Rosa would not have given it up for anything, and Hugh understood this without needing it explained. They would hire a man to work it come spring, and Rosa would ride out there regularly and walk the boundary and check the fence posts and look at the limestone foundation of the house her father had built, and it would be what it always had been. Proof. Captain the dog, who took his name seriously, greeted them at the door with the grave dignity of a dog who had expected this development and simply needed to verify it. He inspected Rosa at length and then allowed her into the house, which she took as high praise. The winter was cold and long and entirely good. They filled the Ashford house with 2 people's worth of living. Rosa's books on the shelves alongside Hugh's tools and maps, her kitchen implements organized with the systematic precision that drove Hugh to gentle bewilderment, and then to genuine admiration. His horses in the barn and her mare Pearl among them. The routine of morning chores and evening fire and long nights of reading and talking, and the particular silence of 2 people who are comfortable together. Rosa learned the horses. She had known horses practically, as working animals, but Hugh knew them the way her father had known land individually, personally, with attention to their specific natures. He showed her how to read Arrow's moods, how to approach the nervous gray mare in stall 3, how to tell from the way a horse holds its head whether it is in pain or merely opinionated. It was the kind of teaching that is not condescending, because it comes from genuine desire to share something loved, and Rosa received it the way she received all things worth knowing, with seriousness and attention, and increasingly with a quiet delight. In the evenings, she taught him things in return. The land survey methodology her father had used, which fascinated Hugh in the abstract geometric way of things that make the world legible. The tax filing system she had developed for the Keene parcel, which he applied to the Ashford books, and which saved them 2 weeks of autumn confusion. The recipe for plum preserves that she had inherited from her mother, which Hugh declared to be the finest thing he had ever tasted, which Rosa chose to believe even if she thought he was being generous. Spring came. They planted the Keene parcel with a hired hand named Ezra, a quiet young man of 22 who was new to Kansas and grateful for work. They expanded the horse breeding operation, selling 4 horses to a cavalry unit passing through, and using the money to build a proper training corral. Rosa organized the household and the books and the land management with the energy of a woman who has had years of stored capability waiting for adequate outlet, and Hugh managed the physical work of the ranch with the steady endurance of a man who has always been his own best resource. Calvin Marsh stayed away. After the judgment, his lawyers had apparently advised him to cut his losses, and while Rosa occasionally heard his name in town in connection with other land disputes, because men like Marsh did not change their fundamental nature, he did not trouble the Ashford Keene acres again. On a morning in April, Rosa told Hugh that she was expecting their child. He went very still in the way he did before important things, standing in the kitchen with his coffee cup, and then he set the cup down very carefully on the counter and turned and looked at her. "In the autumn," he said. "October or November," she said. "I think." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in both his hands and kissed her forehead, and she felt him exhale against her hair, a long, full breath, like a man setting down something he had been carrying for a long time. "Thank you," he said, which was not the conventional response to this announcement, and was also entirely perfectly the right one, because it was honest and enormous and his. It was a mutual project, she said, and felt him laugh against her hair. The pregnancy was, by the standards of the time and place, uncomplicated. Rosa continued to ride, continued to work, continued to manage the books and the Keene parcel records and the household with the same systematic energy. She allowed Hugh to take on heavier physical tasks without argument, not because she could not manage them, but because she recognized that this was one of the ways he was expressing something he could not always put into words, and she understood his language well enough by now to let him speak it. They wrote to Hugh's brother in Nebraska and received back a letter of warmth and mild astonishment and a promise to visit. They wrote to Petrie, who sent a note of congratulations in the formal style of a lawyer who is also, underneath the formality, a genuinely kind person. The summer of 1879 moved through its long days. They rode the boundaries of both properties. They sold horses and bought feed and repaired fences and read by lamplight, and slept in the bed they had made together from lumber Hugh had cut and Rosa had sanded until it was smooth, and woke to mornings that smelled of grass and horses and possibility. And it was all utterly ordinary and utterly extraordinary at once in the way that a life built from scratch by two people who choose each other freely always is. Rosa went into labor on the 17th of October. The midwife from Caldwell came out, a competent, unhurried woman named Marta Belen, who had delivered more babies on the Kansas plains than she could count. And Hugh stayed as close as Marta permitted, which was not very close, and he spent several hours in the kitchen with Captain and the horses and the specific interior experience of a man who loves someone and can do nothing useful at a particular moment. The boy was born near midnight, healthy and furious about it, with a quantity of dark hair and a pair of lungs that made his opinion of the situation abundantly clear. Hugh was allowed in as the first night sound settled, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Rosa, who was exhausted and magnificent, and at the child in her arms, who had settled from furious to deeply serious, regarding the world with dark eyes, and Hugh Ashford, who had built his life with his hands and his patience and his particular quiet steadiness, looked at the two of them and was completely undone in the best possible way. "He looks like you," Rosa said, which was true about the dark hair and might be true about the eyes once they finished deciding what color they were. "He has your expression," Hugh said, which was also true. There was already something watchful and precise about the infant's attention. They named him Thomas James Ashford, Thomas for Rosa's father, James for Hugh's. Thomas James examined the world from Rosa's arms with the gravity of someone who takes new information seriously, and both his parents watched him with the specific reverence of people who have built something that exceeded what they planned. Captain was introduced the following morning, and took his responsibilities toward the infant with complete seriousness. He positioned himself beneath the cradle at night and regarded anyone who approached with careful attention, which Marta found alarming and Hugh found entirely sensible. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was the deep cold kind, the kind that tested structures and people and animals alike. Hugh reinforced the barn in November, adding insulation to the interior walls that Rosa had designed from an agricultural guide. She had been reading agricultural guides since she was 16 and saw no reason to stop, and the horses came through the cold better than most of the ranches in the county. The Keene parcel was managed by Ezra, who had proven himself reliable and steady through 2 seasons, and who had, in the fall, written to his family back in Missouri and brought a younger sister to take a share of the work, which added a welcome domestic energy to the operation. Thomas James, called Tom by everyone except his mother when he had done something she disapproved of, grew from a watchful infant into an astonishingly mobile small person with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined precision, and an enthusiasm for the horses that began when he was about 14 months old and showed no sign of diminishing. Hugh took him into the barn before he could walk without assistance, holding him with both arms while Tom reached for the horses with the imperious certainty of a child who has decided what he loves. "He is going to be a horseman," Hugh told Rosa one evening, with a satisfaction that Rosa found both predictable and endearing. "He is going to be whatever he wants to be," Rosa said, which was the response she would give to this observation every time Hugh made it, because it was the principle her father had applied to her, and she intended to apply it in both directions. "Both can be true," Hugh said. "Both can be true," she agreed. The spring of 1880 brought good rains and good grass, and the Ashford horse operation expanded to 40 animals, including 6 breeding mares and Arrow the bay stallion who had finally, After 2 years of patient work by Hugh and approximately 3 weeks of sincere conversation by Rosa, decided to be cooperative about breeding. Hugh sold horses to 3 ranches, 2 cavalry units, and a stage company, and the books that Rosa kept showed a year that looked like real prosperity. Not the extravagant kind, but the solid, durable kind that comes from knowing what you are doing and doing it well. On the Keene parcel, Ezra and his sister Clara had the spring planting well in hand, and Rosa rode out twice a week to check in and walk the boundary and stand for a few minutes at the northeast corner, where the limestone formation caught the morning light and her father's survey certificate placed the corner pin. She always stood there a little longer than necessary. Hugh had ridden with her enough times to know what she was doing and to simply wait a respectful distance back, which was one of the 1,000 ways he understood her. In the summer of 1880, a young woman came into the Caldwell land office to file a homestead claim. Rosa heard about it from Petrie, who had heard about it from the young clerk at the office, the clerk who had stared at his desk the day Rosa argued with Greer, who had since taken Greer's position when Greer retired. The new clerk processed the young woman's claim without difficulty, and when Petrie mentioned it to Rosa, he mentioned in passing that the clerk had specifically cited the Keene case as precedent for the clear right of a single woman over 21 to file independently. Rosa sat with that information in her kitchen for a moment, with Tom pulling himself up on her knee and biscuit warm against her feet, and thought about how things move through the world, how one woman standing at a counter and refusing to leave, and one man who walked in and confirmed that she was right, had made a small permanent change in the way that particular desk handled particular claims. It was a small thing in the grand accounting of the world, but it was not nothing. It was not nothing at all. She told Hugh that evening when he came in from the barn. He listened, and then he said, "Your father would say that land is the only honest thing because it does not lie about what it is." "He would," Rosa said. "I think the same is true of the law when it is applied correctly," Hugh said. "It shows you what a place actually believes." "It took an argument to make it show," Rosa said. "It usually does," he said. He sat across from her at the oak table that had been her father's and reached across it and took her hand, as he had been doing since October of 1878, and the gesture carried in it the full weight of everything that had accumulated since. All the mornings and evenings, the arguments over agricultural guides and horse training methods, the nights by the fire, the child asleep in the next room with Captain on guard below the cradle. The 2 pieces of land held in 2 names that had become one household and one life. In the early autumn of 1881, Rosa told Hugh she was expecting again. Tom was not quite 2 and still deeply invested in becoming a horseman, and the house was full enough, and Rosa felt the news with the particular combination of joy and exhaustion that comes the second time, which is different from the first, less astonishing but no less significant. This child was a girl, born in March of 1882, arrived more quietly than Tom had and immediately set about making her presence known in every other way. They named her Eliza Margaret for Hugh's mother, whose name he had almost never spoken and spoke now with a care that told Rosa everything she needed to know about what it meant. Eliza had her mother's auburn hair and her father's dark, watchful eyes, and from approximately her first week of coherent attention, she regarded the world with the expression of someone taking inventory. Tom, at 2.5, found Eliza bewildering and then fascinating, and then an object of sincere, protective attention, appointing himself to her care with the same single-minded commitment he brought to the horses. Captain divided his supervision even-handedly between both children, which required more strategic positioning, but which he managed with his usual gravity. The Ashford spread in 1882 was a different thing from what it had been in 1876, when Hugh had arrived on bare land with a broken shed and a plan. The house had been added onto twice, a proper sitting room now, and a second bedroom for the children. The barn held 45 horses in good condition. The corral where Hugh trained young horses was the finest example of its kind in the county, built to specifications that Rosa had drawn up from 3 different sources on equine handling. The Keene parcel ran productive crops under Ezra's management and produced an income that sat in the account Rosa kept at the bank in Caldwell, with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything. It was, objectively and without exaggeration, a good life. But Rosa would have said, and did say, to Hugh, on one of those evenings that were their best hours, sitting on the porch in the deepening dark with the 2 children asleep inside, and Captain somewhere in the vicinity and the vast Kansas stars overhead, that the goodness of it was not an accident or a gift. It was the direct result of 2 people who had each built the capacity for this life independently before finding that they could build it together. If you had not walked into the land office that morning, she said, you would have one anyway, he said. Eventually, she said, which was the same word she had used before but with a different weight to it now because eventually had become specifically, and because specific was where they both lived. I walked in because the door was open, Hugh said, and because it was obviously wrong and I cannot walk past an obvious wrong without saying so. That is my mother's voice in my head. I am glad she gave it to you, Rosa said. He turned to look at her in the dark, and she could see him in the starlight, the familiar landscape of his face, the lines she knew by now as well as she knew the boundary descriptions of her father's survey. And he said, so am I every day, I am glad. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and the Kansas night went on around them, enormous and indifferent and full of stars, and the coyote started up in the south, and the horses shifted in the barn, and the house behind them was warm and full and solid, and it was all exactly what it was, hers, his, theirs. The years moved as years do, not all at once, but in the accumulated weight of seasons. The spring planting and the fall harvest, the foaling season and the sale season. Tom starting school in Caldwell, riding in with Hugh on Mondays and coming home Fridays, growing into a serious-faced boy who could assess a horse's gait at a glance and read survey maps for entertainment, which Rosa found deeply satisfying. Eliza, who went through a period of being fascinated by law, having heard the story of the land office argument approximately 47 times in the version Rosa told it and 80 times in the version Hugh told it, which differed in emphasis if not in fact. You should tell it more, Eliza said to Rosa one evening, when she was about 6 and in the middle of what her parents had privately termed her justice phase. About the part where you said he was wrong about the refiling. I said he was wrong, Rosa confirmed. And a man named Hugh Ashford walked in and said I was right. And then he married you, Eliza said with the direct logic of a child. Eventually, Rosa said. Because he said you were right, Eliza said, working through the causality with great thoroughness. Because, Rosa said carefully, when a person sees a right thing and says so, and when another person sees that they have been understood, yes. That is how it began. Eliza considered this with the dark, watchful eyes she had inherited from her father. I am going to be a lawyer, she announced. Rosa looked at her daughter across the kitchen. You might be, she said. You have the correct disposition for it. Hugh, from the doorway where he had been listening, said absolutely nothing, which was one of his finest qualities. The Keene parcel in 1885 came back into immediate family management when Ezra took up his own claim 2 counties west, having saved enough to do so. Rosa considered selling, as the management from a distance had become more complicated with 2 children and the expanded horse operation. She rode out there on a Thursday in September and stood at the northeast corner by the limestone formation and looked at the 40 acres of good Kansas earth, and then she rode back and told Hugh that she wanted to fold the Keene operation into the Ashford spread, expand the grazing boundaries, add the cultivation acreage to their own accounts, keep the house for family use. Hugh said, "It is your land. Whatever you decide is right. What do you think?" She pressed, because she wanted his opinion and was not going to pretend otherwise. I think combining the operations makes sense financially and practically, he said. And I think keeping the house is the right thing for reasons that have nothing to do with finances. My father's house, she said. Yes, he said. They absorbed the Keene parcel into the Ashford operation in the fall of 1885, and it was a quiet kind of completion, two pieces of ground becoming one coherent whole, as two people had become one household 7 years before. Rosa updated the deed descriptions and filed the consolidated survey with the Caldwell Land Office, now managed by the younger clerk who had learned better habits, and filed it without drama or argument. And the clerk processed it correctly and promptly. And Rosa walked out of the land office into the October sun and thought of the August morning in 1878 when she had walked into this same building with her satchel and her papers and her determination. And a tall man in a battered hat had stood beside her and told the truth. She walked to the livery stable where Pearl was tied. Pearl was getting old now, gray around the nose, steady as ever, and rode home along the creek road, and the grass was amber in the fall light, and the cottonwoods were yellow and dropping leaves, and the road was the same road it had always been, leading east toward the 8 miles that had become her life. Hugh was in the corral with Tom when she arrived, the two of them working with a young horse. Tom was 12 now and entirely competent, following his father's instructions with a focused attention that Rosa recognized as her own, transplanted and adapted, and Hugh's patience, which was something else. She stopped at the fence rail and watched them work together, the language between them mostly wordless, a gesture, a nod, the particular stillness of two people who understand each other's physical presence, and thought about what a remarkable, specific thing it was to see the people you love doing the thing they love, and to be able to stand at the fence rail and watch it. Eliza came out from the house behind Rosa and put her chin on the fence rail beside her mother. At 7, Eliza was still deeply invested in justice, and now also in horses, which she had decided were not contradictory interests, and which Rosa agreed they were not. Papa is teaching Tom the shoulder lead, Eliza said with authority. I see that, Rosa said. I can do the shoulder lead, Eliza said. Papa showed me. I know he did. It is just that Tom gets to do it in the corral because he is older, Eliza said. Your time will come, Rosa said. Everything comes in its season. Eliza considered this with the dark-eyed equanimity she generally applied to philosophical problems. Did you have to wait for your season? She asked. Rosa thought about the land office and the papers and the 3 weeks of waiting and the morning everything turned. Yes, she said, for a long time, and then it came all at once. Was Papa part of the season? Eliza asked. The best part, Rosa said. In the corral, Hugh looked up and saw her at the fence, and she saw him see her, and he lifted one hand in the unhurried greeting of a man who is glad to look up and find the person he expected to find. She lifted a hand in return, and Tom noticed and waved with his whole arm, and the horse took the distraction as an opportunity to make an opinion known about the shoulder lead, and Hugh turned back to the work with the expression of a man who is precisely where he wants to be. Rosa Keene Ashford stood at the fence rail of the spread 8 miles east of Caldwell in the amber Kansas autumn of 1885, with her daughter at her side and her son and her husband in the corral, and the 2 pieces of land her father had dreamed and she had defended, and they had built together stretching out on both sides of the creek road, and she thought about the sum of things, the things that had been unjust, and the things that had been fought, and the things that had been won, and the things that had simply grown. The way good things grow when they are tended with patience and honesty. She thought about the man who had walked into a room of people who were not helping and stood beside her and said 5 words. She thought that the whole of her life since had been those 5 words, expanding outward from that moment like light from an open door, filling in the spaces with everything it was possible to have when one person sees another clearly and speaks the truth without qualification. She is right. And all the rest, the lawyer and the hearing and the marriage and the children and the horses and the house and the consolidated acres, and the old dog captain who had lived to 14, and the new dog Rosie, who took her responsibilities no less seriously, and the lamp in the evening and the fire in the winter, and the plum preserves every autumn, and the long conversations in the dark that were the true architecture of a life. All the rest had been the answer to those 5 words, offered and accepted and built upon, year by year and season by season, into something solid and warm and real and entirely their own. The sun went west across the Kansas sky, and the grass moved in the wind, and Hugh Ashford looked up from the corral again and found his wife still at the fence rail, watching, and she met his eyes across the distance, and everything between them that had ever needed saying had been said, and everything that needed doing had been done, and what remained was this: the open afternoon, the good land, and the two of them, looking at each other across a corral in Kansas, at the end of an argument about a land claim that had turned out to be the beginning of everything. Eliza tugged Rosa's sleeve. "Can we go see Pearl?" "We can," Rosa said, and took her daughter's hand, and they walked together toward the barn, and the afternoon light lay golden on the limestone walls of the house that Hugh had built, and behind them the creek road ran east and west toward the edges of the world, and the coyotes were quiet yet, saving themselves for evening, and it was, in every possible way, enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly, precisely, irreversibly everything.